Thank you, Sandy. Our slides found up the back as an A1 panel, and I was going to put a banner across the top of it, but there were so many messages already because there was so much to distill out of the US trip that I didn't. But if you search at the bottom of that A1 panel, you'll find the theme of what I'm going to talk about today. And it comes from Mike McCallum, who's a futurist. And as leaders of cities, as planners, that's the nature of our role, isn't it? We're here and we're taking our places, our regions, our economies, our population, our community forward into uncharted territory. And that's becoming more ambiguous where we're going with every day. The 21st century is profoundly unlike the 20th century. And so in Penrith, we're always scanning the horizon, looking for where the future might lie, but also looking in our rear vision mirror and knowing that repeating those things won't carry us into a desirable future. And so the words that Mike McCallum said and that I did quote on the panel is that this is not the time for a crisis of imagination. And certainly across the great cities that we saw in the States, we didn't see a crisis of imagination in those places. I'll attest that I found the trip immensely rewarding. Penrith's project actually evolved out of the trip, and I describe it as the DNA of a successful city, the ingredients for a successful city in the 21st century. And I'm going to talk on 4 themes under those ingredients, or the DNA of a successful city. Forward-looking is the first one, and I've touched on that already. We kept hearing this term millennials, bobbed up here, it bobbed up there, and they're like, millennials. Well, I understand them to be the people of the 21st century, beyond the Gen Ys. But what does it mean? And this goes to another point I'm going to make repeatedly during my address. Things are not as they seem, and I'll come back to that. But what are millennials? Well, millennials, to me, infers forward-looking. And the cities that we went to were forward-looking. They were catering for the future. They were rich with density. They were hooked into a movement economy. They were focused on jobs of the 21st century. Their places had a thick, effective jobs density. They had an evening economy, and they had intelligent infrastructure. I was looking back in preparation for today at some notes from Phoenix, and there were 2 little graphs or logos that stood out in the Sun Corridor diagram. They said that 2/3 of the housing units required in Phoenix by 2050 are yet to be built, and 50% of the transport infrastructure is yet to be built. So immense growth, and clearly that infrastructure, the challenge of funding that infrastructure, if they're to chase it out to suburbs in the low density fashion they have in Phoenix as they have in the past, is just impossible. So they're scanning the horizon, they're recognising growth, they're seeing big troubles coming unless they take a big paradigm shift in how they're planning to place their new communities and to move people around and to agglomerate the intelligence and the economy amongst those people. The second point I wanted to make was culture, and it's well known. You know, you wouldn't be surprised. Of course, the US is renowned for having an economy premised on growth. And it was just so refreshing to see how that was played out. They approach from a can-do attitude and very pro-development. They make much greater use of catalysts. And in this I talk about nothing is as it seems. So when you go to Glendale outside Phoenix, you'll be driving across a Mesa flat, I think it might be, it's probably not the right term, but anyway. And then out of the desert will loom this bright $380 million stadia where the Arizona Phoenix Cardinals play out of. And they're not tied to that for the long term. They'll be there as long as it suits them, probably locked into perhaps ambitiously a 2-decade contract, but perhaps only 1 decade. But the state and the people will fund that infrastructure, and perhaps they'll push it over within that time frame. But in the meanwhile, what they'll do is they'll get that catalytic development will bring other development around it, and they'll kickstart an economy in an area that we're struggling. Rail is not rail. Rail is about a movement economy. It's about agglomerating big populations. It's about combining disparate economies, very relevant in the context of Western Sydney, where you have the regional cities of Parramatta, Penrith, Liverpool and Campbelltown, all relatively isolated. So rail isn't about rail, it's about agglomerating economies. Density. Density isn't even density in its own right. Density, in one expression, is an opportunity to innovate. The economies that come with having big populations and big stratas and big community titles allow groups like Flow to innovate in terms of infrastructure for the 21st century. Not chasing it with antiquated 20th century sewer and water, but 21st century infrastructure. And the Americans, by my observation, do it very much better with the use of catalyst projects. Value capture. Even in the most capitalist of cultures, the US recognises let's grease the wheel sufficiently for people to make money, but let's revolve some of that profit back to local community benefit, and we saw many examples of that. We also saw, oops, I apologise, I've moved on to creative financing. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Just to finish culture, we also saw that they don't infatuate with community engagement. And our city is very, very focused, do not get us wrong. But they don't grind to a halt in doing community engagement. 20% of the people in most of the cities we went to voted. So 20% vote, and when it comes time to impose a special tax, they go to those voters, or via that voting process, they determine if the community as a whole wishes to pay a tax for transportation or a stadia or the like. So 20%, and they need to get a majority of the 20%, so you're getting 11%, let's say, of the whole population agreeing. But then they introduced other downstream mechanisms for community engagement and involvement. So even if you're not swept up in the poll or the vote, the 11%, or perhaps if it's a super majority, the 15% of the voters that agree to an initiative, they capture you later through other community engagement processes like community outreach. And sorry, I drifted on to creative financing. That's my third. So we've done forward-looking culture, creative financing. Well, it's a radically different culture. They don't turn to government first for all things. It was really apparent in the second week in New York. I actually got the time to pick up a newspaper and listen to a bit of radio and look at what was going on. And I read about an initiative where in Australia it would patently have been government funding. And the final paragraph was, oh, almost by the way, the funding is going to be sourced from philanthropy or the private sector. So they don't turn to government. We have an entrenched behaviour, a pattern of behaviour of turning to government for all things. Phoenix, by way of example, through $1.4 billion public investment, brought about $5.4 billion worth of private investment. Just these little gems that we picked up. But how transferable really are the things that we saw in the States to Australia? Let's be honest, we've got a population of around 24 million. Sydney's population is 4.2 million. How could it ever be transferable? Well, to me, I think they are profoundly transferable, but what we need to be is even smarter. We need to make greater use of catalysts. We need to see a project not for what it is. An airport isn't an airport. An airport could have been built 2 decades ago in Western Sydney if it had not been described as an airport, if it had been described as a fundamental part of the economy, if it had been described as a fundamental enabler, if it had been deeply embedded with infrastructure to connect Western Sydney and to balance Sydney, more to the point, to balance Sydney so that it had a strong economy in Western Sydney. And that argument will perhaps be won now, and an airport will be built to the extent that it carries the jobs and it's not described as an airport and it carries the infrastructure with it. Vertical fiscal imbalance. Now in the States, of course, because you've got most of the cities we went to, their populations in their regions were bigger than Australia. So they have the ability to be able to, and they've got legislative right to be able to impose taxes and the like. So we're not going to be able to do that. So we've got to be even smarter. I find it interesting we rush to a debate about, or open up a debate about GST to pay down debt for health that's looming. We don't have a contra discussion about how GST might be used to fund productivity, city-shaping infrastructure. And surely it's time to bring on that debate, because that's what we need to do in an Australian context. My final point is that, because I am on time, my final point is that it seems to me that there is a repeatable measure for success of cities in the 21st century. The places we went to, they had large-scale economy. They had a big population, ability to tap into a big intellectual mass and a big institutional mass, both inside government, inside universities and corporate headquarters, the private sector. They had a big population. They were relevant to other levels of government. but not relevant just to receive funding, but because they had a capacity to be able to self-determine their economic destiny. They had relevance to the private sector and lending institutes, and they were able to look back and learn from that growth as they grew to be at 20 million. So my proposition is that there's a fractal. A fractal is a self-repeating pattern. It's most often used in maths or science. But I think there's a fractal, which is a repeatable measure for successful cities and regions. And in Australia's case, I think that's at least in the order of 1 million. So when we talk sub-regional planning, when we talk metropolitan planning, regional planning in Newcastle, Greater Sydney commissions and the like, I think the fractal that we should be looking at, and I'm not talking amalgamations, I'm talking about governance arrangements, I'm talking about recognising economies not as a city economy but a regional economy. I think the fractal concept needs to be applied. I'll leave it there, and I just wanted to take this moment to thank Ed, Harriet, Sandy and the others, and all behind this trip. I found it immensely rewarding. I won't tell you about the project that we're dealing with. We're dealing with a multitude of projects at Penrith, but we're going to apply those 4 principles, those 4 concepts, those 4 elements of a successful city in the 21st century as a result of this trip. Thank you.